Well, we had a good year this year with the bees and the flow supers. All of this came out of flow supers. I had about 4 supers that filled with honey and got almost 20 gallons of honey out of that. I've got several cases in the house, and this I'm taking to the food pantry to feed the needy. And I also learned quite a bit about how to successfully work a flow hive that I thought I'd share with you. Well, I thought I'd share my experiences with the flow hive with the YouTube community. I purchased the original flow hive a long time ago when they first offered it, and bought some more of those original flow frames and supers from Australia. And unfortunately, I have quite a few hives, so as a result of that, paying $500 a super is just too much. So I experimented this last year with the Chinese version of it. I think it's called auto frame. And what I found was I had in my experiment, I had 4 supers that were filled with honey this spring, and 2 of them they filled 2 Australian and 2 Chinese, and they filled them equally well. They filled them all the way to the top on both the Chinese and the Australian. And then when I did my draining of the flow hive, I found that there was no difference in the ease of use between the Chinese and the Australian. As a result of that, I think paying 1/5 the price with the Chinese frames is a pretty good economic decision. I'm sorry that Flow has priced their hives so high that a lot of people aren't interested and of even trying them out. But if you do try them out, you won't be able to afford very many of them if you've got quite a few hives. Anyway, on top of finding out that the Chinese frames were equally as effective, I wanted to share with you some of my experiences with the Flow to maybe help you get past some of the problems I ran into. One of the issues when you get your flow is the frames. When they come out of the box, they have 2 caps. You see that there's a cap at the top and then a cap at the bottom to keep the honey into the frame until you're ready to drain. The problem with these caps when they come out of the box is they're clear and they're small, and you're outside in your apiary trying to do what you need to do, and these things will get very easily lost. And I had a couple of 3 occasions where I spent a lot of time trying to find a cap that had fallen on the ground, and because they're small and clear, they're very difficult. So my recommendation, as soon as you get your frames out, take those caps, put them on a piece of cardboard, spray paint them with some fluorescent or some high visibility paint, and save yourself a lot of problems later, because typically these flow frames will come with only 1 cap and 1 cover, and you can't get more. They're just not available by themselves. So make sure that you do this immediately before you have a chance to lose them. Now, the one I'm showing you on the video here is actually a Chinese version, and they sell them mostly online as the frames, just the 7 frames. So you're going to have to take a deep super and modify that. Fortunately, I'll give you a link to how to do that. They do send you some dimensions and this kind of thing, but you're going to need a little woodworking to accommodate the frames in your deep super. First, of course, you're going to need to cut this notch up here for the cap. So this is where you're going to put your key to open the frames up, and then you're going to have to take a cover, cut a cover out like I've got here to cover up the remainder of the frames, and this is also where you're going to be pulling out your honey. Now, as far as the top is concerned, the lid, most lids, if you buy them, what they call the migration lid, where you are going to have a cover or a piece of wood over each end here, the front and the back are going to be a problem. So what I did is I actually adjusted my lids. Some of them, if they had the front and the back cleat, I'd take the back cleat off and I'd put it on the top instead of the bottom, and that supported the warping that might take place on the plywood, but it also accommodated me to where I could get at the covers where the keys are going to be going in. So you're going to need to adjust your top if you use that. Personally, I like the migration covers, the just standard piece of wood over the super, rather than the telescoping cover. Telescoping covers are heavy, they require two pieces, you've got an inner cover and an outer cover, and they don't allow me to do what I really enjoy doing and found to be most effective, which is feeding the bees in the spring to get them ready for honey flow. The problem with the telescoping cover is you can't go in from the top, and I have found, because I've been beekeeping for a lot of years, is that I've tried just about every form of feeding, and the problem with them is that almost every one of them, except the one I'm going to talk to you about here, has some pretty critical negatives to it. The worst, which I think a lot of us start out with because they usually come in with a beginner's kit, is the entrance feeder. That's a feeder that goes here, has a jar here, and the problem with that is that first you're encouraging robbing, because this is where the robbers are going to be, and they're smelling that sugar syrup in there, and of course that's they're going to have to somehow defend that. You can't put an entrance reducer over it, or you're going to have to adjust your entrance reducer because it's taking up part of your entrance here. The other thing is that you're going to have to be right there trying to take away the empty jar and put a new jar in right in front of the guard bees. So you're going to have to smoke, you're going to have to deal with the guard bees, and you're going to encourage robbing. So I think the entrance feeder is the worst idea of all. The other kind of feeder that is pretty popular is the internal feeder, where there's a frame or a black receptacle that goes into one of the 5 frames slots, and you feed it by pouring it in. Well, real bad problems there is because first off, if you got an entrance, if you got a pool of sugar water in your hive, then bees are going to drown. Almost every one of those internal feeders has a bee drowning issue. The other thing is every time you feed, you have to smoke and open up the hive to get at the feeder to even check it to see if it needs to be fed, or whether and then you're going to have to deal with bees as they come out, because they're right there as you open it up to get to the feeder. So I didn't like that. So I ended up trying the outside feeders, where you take a big 5-gallon bucket, drill holes in it, and put it upside down and do the external outdoor feeding. Well, the problem there is those 5-gallon buckets full of sugar syrup are not only a big mess, but you also have to carry those things out there, and you have to dump them upside down, which of course they're going to leak pretty heavily, especially in the beginning till they get that suction going. And you're feeding every bee in the community, not only your bees, but your neighbors' bees and wild bees and yellow jackets, and pretty much anything that comes around is going to be looking for that sugar syrup that you're putting out. So you can't really make sure that the bees that you're trying to feed are actually getting at that, because all the other bees, especially from the strong hives, are muscling them out. I'm not confident that I'm getting what I want out of the outside feeders. So what I've found to be the absolute best, in fact I can't even imagine feeding otherwise, is to use a top feeder like this. And you have a half-gallon ball jar, which is plenty of food. And what you do is you put about half of it up with sugar. This is in the spring feeding when you're doing 1-to-1. Half of it up a little lower than half the sugar. Put hot water in there till you dissolve it. And be sure you put about somewhere between 2 teaspoons or so of apple cider vinegar in there, so you don't start that black mold growing into your sugar syrup if they're taking too long to drain the jar. That vinegar, that apple cider vinegar, really stops your mold from growing, and the bees seem to like it. So it's apple cider. I'm sure they've been eating and drinking off rotten apples, getting the sugar out of it for thousands of years. But anyway, so they don't seem to mind the vinegar, and it'll save you a lot of problems with nasty jars full of kind of mold. Okay, then what you do is you have, of course, your hive cover, and you get a piece of 1/8" hardware cloth so that the bees can't get through it. You put that onto your cover, and then you take a 1/2 inch. You need a 1/2 inch piece of plywood. With you drill a 3-inch hole. You can get those 3-inch hole saws at Harbor Freight for just a few bucks, and drill that and place that over here. Then your ball jar, you need to take the lid and pound it out to where this typically it's recessed, but you pound it out to where it's flat, so that when you put your ball jar on your feeder, the bees can actually get at it. I have found that the 1/2 inch is the perfect width for the lid. And so the lid will fit in there securely, and you don't have to worry about it falling over. And the wonderful part is that you can actually monitor your hives this way. You can look out across your bee yard. You see everybody's jars. If a jar is going down, fairly rapidly, you've got a strong hive. If you see a jar that's just they're barely eating in there, you better check those bees. Something's up. They might not be doing so well. A good strong hive will suck it down, and in a few days, and so that'll help you kind of know how your bees are doing. The other thing is, when you're going to feed. I mean, you can look out there and say, okay, it's time to feed. They're out. So you can sit there with your coffee in the morning and just look out over your bee yard and know whether you need to be making more sugar. Then when you get ready to feed, you don't even need a veil. You definitely don't need a smoker, because you're going to come into the back of the hive. You take this off. The bees are all in there. They've been used to getting that sugar. You put they aren't coming out because they can't. And you're in the back of the hive, so you aren't dealing with the entrance and the guard bees. And you aren't encouraging robbing because you're inside the hive with the feed. And they can't drown because they're not a pool of sugar syrup in there for them to drown in. And you don't have to take the top off. So this is the only way to feed. And then you just slip your new syrup on there. You're good. That's the end of your problems with getting the feed. So this to me is the only way to go as far as feeding bees. Okay, now that's the top. That's putting the hive together. But then you're going to place it. Now with a flow hive, you're going to have it to where it tilts back. To be able to get the honey to flow backwards into your tubes there. Well, if you tilt a typical hive back, unless you've got a screened bottom board, when it rains, well, then the water will run into the entrance and then set up in the hive and cause problems. So most hives, they tilt it forward to keep the rain from running in the entrance. Well, of course, that's a problem when you get ready to drain your flows. So the easiest way to address this is, what I found is, if you take a 1/2 inch PVC pipe, put it right in the middle, screw it down to a board, and then and use that as your base. And then you take a block like this, you put it in the back, and that supports the typical scenario where you're just having bees come in the front and keep the rain out. Now when you get ready to drain your super, you just pull this block out, you push on the back of the hive, it rocks it back like that. You put this under the front, and then you drain your flow hive, and then when you're through draining and you're through extracting or doing what you're doing there, taking out the honey, then you pull this out, push it back down like that, and then you have and then you brace it again like that, and you're good for the rest of the year. Now, how to drain the honey. Now, the normal video shows them putting a tube in here and having a jar here. Well, that's just asking for trouble. First off, if it's just a jar, well, the bees will come around and they'll try to get in your jar, and then you've got a real issue. The other thing is, if you're draining one frame at a time, it takes a while to drain a frame, and that's you know, if you've got quite a few hives, or several hives actually, that can be taking quite a while. So what I've found, and it works great because I just did it on several hives, is I get these tubes at Home Depot. They're 1-inch ID interior, so they fit over your tube that comes with your flow hive, and they're 1 1/4-inch OD, the outside diameter, and then get an easy off lid at Walmart for $1.25, and you drill seven 1 1/4-inch holes in the lid. Here's how I did mine, so you can see how I drill my holes in there. And then now, this is one thing you learn from experience, is that you do not want those tubes to be too deep because they get in the honey, and you definitely don't want them coming out because then honey is everywhere. So what I found to be very effective in this regard is to put a couple of zip ties and pull it tight with a pair of pliers so there's really locks onto that plastic tube. Put a couple of zip ties on both the inside of the cover and the outside of the cover, and that lets the tube rotate, and it also keeps the tube from coming out or going in too deep. And I'd leave it about 3 or 4 inches in. What I've found is that when you do drain a flow hive, the flow super, the deep flow super, will, if it's full, will come about 4 to 4.5 gallons of honey. So it's perfect for a 5-gallon bucket. Then what you do is you take your 5-gallon bucket, you put it on the ground. Now this is one thing you're going to have to do prior to extracting, is find out the distance from your typical, you know, depending on how you have supported your hive, how far it is from your flow frame to your bucket, because you want the bucket sitting on the ground. This thing is going to be heavy when you get through. And then what you do, let me stop it here and I'll start it again. Okay, so you set up your bucket. You get this easy off cover. These food safe buckets at Walmart, I think, are the best deal. They're less than $3 for a 5-gallon bucket, and like $1.25 for an easy off lid. And then you drill your 7 holes in there so that you have 7 tubes coming up. And then what you do is you pull off one of your covers and insert your tube. And I would suggest you put a jar on the top, because you want to keep a hold of those covers, and you're going to need to pull these two. I use pliers because they're easy to get better than my big fingers in there. And then what you do is you just go on down, you pull a cover, you insert your tube, and you go on down and you get all 7 tubes in there. Then you come along and then you just open every one of those frames. Then you go back to the house and get some tea, because the bees can't get into the honey, and this is going to take a while to drain. And so you're draining all 7 at the same time, and I'm telling you, within 30-45 minutes, if it's a hot summer, so the honey's fairly didn't very viscous at that point. It'll flow right on in there, and you're going to be shocked, because I know I was when I went to then I come back and I take this cover off. I have a new one that doesn't have holes in it and doesn't have tubes, and put that on there, and boy, when you pick that thing up, that thing weighs 60 pounds, and it feels like it's glued to the ground. But all of the honey is drained from your flow hive, and you haven't had any problems. You haven't had any bees or leakage or any of that stuff that you see on other videos where people are trying to deal with how to get the honey out of the flow frames. Then Then of course all you do is just go back. You've let it have time to drain, and so then you just put your covers back in there, and you're done. You're done probably for the year. Then what you do, of course, is you're through draining, and so you're going to let the bees. I would put the frames back to where they can get into those cells. Let the bees clean up all the honey that's kind of on the flow frame, get that all cleaned up. Then what you do is, as you've let them have time to clean the honey off the super, is just take the super off, because you're going to want to feed in the spring, so you don't need that super up there. And just you don't need to take it to a honey house. You don't need to mess up your kitchen or anything. Just take those supers and put them on a pallet out there somewhere, and let the bees clean them up. And so now you're ready to store your supers. The bees have cleaned them all up, and you're through for the year. I mean, it's so much easier than all that extracting and uncapping, and then a honey house full of bees, and then robbing is just a nightmare with all the bees mad, and it's hot, and you're killing bees right and left, and they're stuck. You can't get them out of your supers, so they're coming into the honey house with you. I mean, that's the biggest mess in the world. I wouldn't be a beekeeper if I was still having to do that. So that's the process. Now, one thing I would suggest is when you buy your flow frames, is before you put them to the bees, that you buy some wax, or if you've got some wax, I had a bunch of cappings and stuff from old days, and you get a thing like this, put it in a pan with hot water, boiling water, and usually one this size will fit down in a pan, and get that wax all melted, and then you take a trim roller and you roll each of the frames with that hot wax. I tried just the straight frames with no wax on them, and the bees had a hard time. I don't even know if those frames actually the bees ever used them. But the ones that I rolled the wax on, they went right to them and went right to work. So I would say you're going to need to put beeswax on those frames initially to get the bees to take to them. Okay. Let me stop it and see if there's anything else that comes to my mind. Oh, one thing I would say is when you're making your super available for your frames, this piece down here, this aluminum, this is a piece of aluminum bar here. You're going to definitely need that, because they'll be coming out of the rabbet from the frames below if you open up and you don't have this bar. The other thing is, I found, instead of having in the video that's online about how to make a super into a flow super, they have you chopping out an area in each side here to sink down this bar. However, what I found, if you get a 1/16 inch aluminum bar, you don't even have to do that. Just get a real small flat screw, and then you can just screw it here, and there's not enough bee space in a 1/16 of an inch to actually have to fool with trying to chisel it out and trying to get it flush. If you want to, that's fine, but I didn't find it necessary, and I didn't do them on my hives. The other thing is that you're going to need to save the plug that comes out of your hole saw when you make your feeder, and that way you make a plug for those times where you aren't feeding and you don't want the rain coming in. Okay, well, I have to say that I think the flow hive is the greatest invention ever. I would not be a beekeeper if I was back into the robbing, extracting, uncapping, and then 2 days of clean up all that sticky mess. I just wouldn't do it. But this, where you just go out and you just end up with a bucket of honey that's already filtered. Now, let me say this about that, because I've got the way I did it. I was a little concerned that even though the honey that flows into the bucket is going to be really clean of any bees or debris, I still, when I get ready to put them in a jar, I don't want to have to fish anything out of honey when I see it going into a jar. So what I did is I created kind of a filter here. I got a 5-gallon bucket, and I cut off the bottom of it, and because you want it high enough to where it's going to be over your honey, but low enough to where you can stick it down in. And then I put pet screen. Now, regular window screen isn't going to be tough enough to be able to handle the pounds of honey that you're going to be pouring on top of this. But Home Depot sells pet screen, which is screen for your windows that pets can't even scratch through. Even your dogs or cats can't scratch through there. And this stuff is extremely tough. And I just pop riveted pet screen over this as my filter. Then I had a piece of vinyl siding because what I want to do is to be able to take a bucket that have poured honey in, and I want to be able to turn it upside down and let it just drain through the screen into the bucket where I'm going to be drawing the honey out. And of course you're going to have to have a bucket with a gate on it so that you can so you'll be draining it into there to get your jars filled. You're going to have to have a honey gate on a 5-gallon bucket to do that. But this way, while you're filling jars, the honey can be leaving this 5-gallon bucket here. You'll pretty much get all your honey. It'll go through the screen and be ready in the bottom one to put more honey into your distribution bucket. Okay, I think I've thought of most things that I wanted to tell you about. I will make a video on a couple of other ideas that I've had that seem to work. I have lots of ideas, but not all of them seem to work, so I want to share those ideas that actually solved a problem and did work. It did work in real life. Okay, well, thank you for watching. Hope this helped.